Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Good morning, dear students. As you know, we discussed the aggregate demand in the previous chapter. Today, we will be talking about the aggregate supply. The definition of aggregate supply is given. Aggregate supply is the total supply of all goods and services in the economy by all producers. It means that in a country or in an economy, all goods and services which are produced by all producers at different price levels is called aggregate supply or the total supply. This is almost similar to the definition which we studied in the microeconomics of an individual commodity, but that was for one commodity and by one producer. Here we are talking about aggregate supply, which means that here we talk about the supply of all goods and services, not a single commodity, rather overall goods and services. And also here we do not talk about one producer, we talk about all producers in the economy. So this is a very simple definition of aggregate supply. Let me repeat again. Aggregate supply is the total supply of all goods and services produced by all producers in the economy. So when we talk about the relationship between aggregate supply and price level, so there is a positive relationship, we can say, between the output production in the economy and price level. In short run, we have almost a visible relationship between price level and aggregate supply, and that is positive. Whenever price level increases, aggregate supply will also increase because the producers find it profitable to sell more output at high price. So you can see that we have a upward sloping straight aggregate supply, and we call it SRAS, which means short run aggregate supply. Price level on vertical axis and horizontal axis, we have measured the aggregate output supplied. So between price level and aggregate supply or output, we have positive relationship. This curve is called short run aggregate supply, SRAS. Now, the duration of the short run is not defined. Just like in financial subjects, we usually define short run a time period of almost 1 or less than 1 year. But in economics, short run or short term has not a specified definition. Rather, it depends on the time in which an economy reaches to its capacity. According to the classical group of economists, they say that aggregate supply has no relationship with the price level in long run, because the economy operate at a capacity at a full employment level, and any increase in the price level in the long run will not increase the aggregate supply because it will be at full employment level. All the resources are fully utilized in the long run. So we can see that relationship also with the help of this aggregate supply curve. You can see it's different than the previous one. This aggregate supply, it is the long run aggregate supply curve. In fact, it includes both short run and long run. How to differentiate here in this graph between short run and long run aggregate supply? You know, this straight portion of this aggregate supply curve, this straight portion, It is the long run aggregate supply curve, because at this is the maximum level of output which an economy, which a country can produce by utilizing all of its resources. But this reaches to, but this reaches in the long run. It's a long run phenomenon according to the classical economist. Economy operate at the long run, in the long run at full employment level. So aggregate supply becomes what? Vertical. This portion you can see of aggregate supply, it is the short run aggregate supply curve. So this graph includes both short run and long run. Okay, let's see. At low levels of aggregate output, the curve is fairly flat, and the economy approaches to capacity, the curve becomes nearly vertical, and at capacity the curve is vertical. You can see it's a vertical, and that is the capacity level, it's a full employment level. Here it's a bit flatter because at this stage the output level is very less due to very less aggregate demand in the economy. Prices are also very low. So any increase in aggregate demand, a smaller increase in aggregate demand shall cause a greater change in the output over here. Rather, a small increase in the price level will occur, which will encourage the producer to increase output by a greater percentage. So supply in this case is more elastic, you can say. It's flatter, but when it reaches to capacity, it becomes vertical, right? It's a very simple concept. I hope you understood it. Let's understand further. Macroeconomists focus on whether or not the economy as a whole is operating at full capacity or full employment. Full capacity means full employment, which means all factors of production, particularly labor and capital, are fully utilized in the economy. As the economy approaches to maximum or capacity, firms respond to further increase in demand by rising prices. I told you that in the long run, any increase in aggregate demand will only increase the price level, and the aggregate supply will not increase because all resources are fully utilized. So only price level increases, and that price level will not affect the aggregate supply. Let's talk about the output levels and the price output responses. When the economy is operating at a low level of output, an increase in aggregate demand is likely to result in an increase in the output with little or no increase in the overall price level. I told you, when the economy is operating at a low level, which means in the recession, usually aggregate demand is very low in the recession, and because of that prices are also very low and there is less aggregate supply. But when aggregate demand increases by a smaller, you can say, percentage, it will increase the price level by a smaller percentage, but the effect on aggregate supply will be more. Aggregate supply will increase more by a greater percentage. So that is, in that case, the aggregate supply will respond more to a less change in the price in the recession, or you can say when the economy is operating at a low level. The response of input prices to changes in the overall price level. We talked about the prices of goods. I told you whenever price of goods increases or whenever price level increases, aggregate supply will increase. But the relationship between the prices of goods and services and the prices of inputs, or you can say the wages, the relationship is pretty, a positive one, but there are time lags involved. Time is involved. For example, when price level or prices of goods and services increases today, it will not affect, this increase in the prices will not affect the labor wages in a time being, you can say. But after some time, it will definitely affect the wages, because the labor will realize that their real value of their money has been decreased because of increase in the prices. Then they will start bargaining, they will start protests, they will start boycotts, and they will try to increase their wages by protesting. So When price level increases, labor wages in the meanwhile will not increase, but after some time it will increase. So you can say there is a time lag involved. There must be a lag between changes in input prices and changes in the output prices. Otherwise, the aggregate supply price output response could be vertical. You can say that. When we talk about the time lags, I told you there is a time involved. Whenever price of goods and services increases, and immediately it will not affect the labor wages, but after some time it will increase the labor wages. Wage rate may increase at exactly the same rate as the overall price level, if the price level is fully anticipated. Here we talk about the labor anticipation. If the labor expects that the prices of goods and services in future shall increase, then they will also talk about increase in their wages. But since the labor don't realize or don't anticipate the price level changes easily, that's why they cannot increase their wages by negotiations. So I told you there is always a lag involved. There is always a time involved between the effect of input prices and the output prices. Okay, so that was about the time lags. Then the next topic, that is the shifts in aggregate supply curve. Now, what are the factors which bring shift in the aggregate supply curve? A cost shock or a supply shock is a change in the cost that shift aggregate supply curve. So any effect which affects the cost of production, so it will affect the aggregate supply on the graph, and we show that effect with the help of shift. It can either be outward shift or it can be either an inward shift. So it depends on the factors. What are the factors which affects the aggregate supply? We are talking about the other factors over here. The prices of goods and services in this case are constant. So what are these other factors which affects the aggregate supply and which brings shift in the aggregate supply curve? Let's see that. Now you can see these factors over here. Factors that shift the aggregate supply curve. Okay, shift to the right, which means increase in aggregate supply. Shift to the left, which means decrease in aggregate supply. Now these are the factors. Lower cost. If, for example, labor wages decreases, raw material prices decreases, the producer will hire more labor, will buy more raw material, and will increase output, right, in the economy. So aggregate supply curve will shift outward. It will be an outward shift. So that's basically the meaning. Shift to the right means outward shift. Shift to the left means inward shift. Okay, economic growth. It's another factor which brings shift in the aggregate supply. And in economic growth, we talk about the capital, we talk about labor, technology, and all these factors. If capital increases, if more labor or productivity of labor increases, or technological factor occurs, the producer gets new technology, for example, the ability to produce will increase, and aggregate supply curve will shift to the right, or outward shift will occur. Public policy, it is also a factor which affects the supply aggregate supply curve. It will bring a shift. Supply side policies, for example, government decreases taxes on the producers, the producer will be encouraged, they will be producing more output, and aggregate supply curve will shift outward. Weather, let's say if good weather occurs in the economy, it will affect the supply of agriculture commodities, particularly agriculture production will increase, and it will increase the overall aggregate supply in the economy, and aggregate supply curve will shift outward. So you can say weather is also a very important factor. And when you reverse these factors, we will have an inward shift, or supply curve will shift to the left. So instead of lower cost, let's say we take high cost, labor wages, for example, increases, raw material prices increases, the producer will hire less labor, will buy less raw material, and will produce less output. So aggregate supply curve will shift inward. Instead of economic growth, we are talking about stagnation. For example, economy does not move forward, and it is standing, at a particular position. So instead of increasing supply will decrease because the producer, they do not anticipate growth, or they do not anticipate prospects in the future. So that's why capital deterioration in this case will occur, because the economy is not producing more capital. Instead of the existing capital is getting wear out, you can say. It's deteriorated. So that's basically the point. Public policy, I told you, if government increases taxes on the producers, right? What happens? Producers, they find it more costly to produce output. So instead of producing more output, they will produce less output because the taxes have been increased on them. And bad weathers, again, it contributes to less production in agriculture, and overall aggregate supply will be less in the economy, and the aggregate supply curve will shift inward. So these were all the important factors which are responsible for bringing shift. Last topic, that is the general, the equilibrium in the economy. Uh, Equilibrium in the economy means when aggregate demand equals to aggregate supply, you can say. We studied this concept in the micro economics also. But here we talk about the country, or at the economy level, when the aggregate supply or aggregate demand curves they intersect at a particular point. We call it equilibrium. We have an equilibrium level of output over here, and we have equilibrium price over here. So economy, usually they operate, they are supposed to operate at the equilibrium level, and aggregate demand should be equal to aggregate supply in order to keep the price level constant in the economy. Whenever price level changes, it shows changes in the equilibrium. It shows the change in aggregate demand and aggregate supply. That's all. If you have any question, you can ask any question, in the group, and I'll be there to answer your questions. This chapter is finished, and inshallah in the coming class we will be talking about chapter number 4, inflation. Till then, have a good time. Khuda Hafiz.